Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be joining from. My name is Nathan Thompson, and I am the Senior Managing Editor of the Journal on Education in Emergencies. Thank you for joining to celebrate the launch of our latest publication, our special issue on mobilizing an effective, equitable, and just data and evidence ecosystem for education in crisis and conflict contexts. Over the next 75 minutes, we will highlight the impressive work of the authors whose research and field work appear in the recent issue. Shelby, can you advance the slide, please? All of the articles we discussed today, and indeed the special issue in its entirety, are available free of charge from the INEE website, as are all past issues of JEiE. I encourage you to take a moment to check out the issue today. And as we proceed with the presentations and the event today, our managing editor, Samantha Colon, will provide various links to JEiE pages and the pages for the new issue. I would now like to take a moment to introduce JEiE's editor-in-chief, Dr. Dana Birdie, who will share a bit more about JEiE's work and put the special issue into broader context for today. Dr. Birdie is a professor and director of international education at New York University's Department of Applied Statistics, Social Science, and Humanities, and faculty at NYU's Politics Department, NYU Abu Dhabi, and NYU's Center for Practice and Research at the intersection of information, society, and methodology, a center that's called PRISM. She is also a faculty fellow at the Association for Analytic Learning about Islam and Muslim Societies. Her research focuses on education, peace, and conflict, and has been funded by a number of domestic and international funders. Her book, Stools for Conflict or for Peace in Afghanistan, won the 2017 Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. Dana, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nate. Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here today with all of you and so excited to have this webinar, otherwise known as a seminar if we were in person, I guess. So welcome again to the launch of the Journal on Education in Emergencies, Volume 11, Number 1, our special issue on mobilizing an effective, equitable, and just data and evidence ecosystem for education in crisis and conflict contexts. Many of you are familiar with the Journal on Education in Emergencies, but I'm going to still talk about a little bit of the special factors and features of the journal, what makes it so different and so outstanding in the field. What you may not realize is that we maintain an entirely open access model of publication. This is known as a diamond open access model, and at the same time we adhere to rigorous academic standards. This is quite unusual in academia. This means that all of our content is immediately accessible to readers everywhere at no cost, and authors are never charged submission or publication fees. This model helps us to promote greater equity in disseminating evidence and in allowing for more equitable uptake and use, and of course, allowing for more equitable publications. Following our call for papers in December 2025, when we first initiated the ideas for this current special issue, we invited members of the EIE field to examine critical questions about standardization and localization, persistent evidence gaps and funding structures, ethical data collection and use, priorities of crisis-affected communities themselves, what they themselves prioritize, and what effective, equitable, and just leadership of the data and evidence ecosystem looks like. That is a tall order, and I'm happy to say we had a broad and compelling take-up response to our call for papers. So in response, the contributions selected for this special issue present analyses and critiques of the education emergencies data and evidence ecosystem, working in teams of academics, practitioners, and policymakers who live and work across East Africa, the Central Sahel, the Caribbean, and Central, South, and Southeast Asia. These authors draw attention to the importance of rigorous, inclusive, and accountable data and evidence in informing EIE policy, programming, and funding decisions. These are really critical areas, and I just want to draw attention again to the diverse perspectives from locations, but also from academics, practitioners, and policymakers who work together. As a hallmark of our field, I would say, is this collaboration across all of these areas, all of these types of work to support the field of education emergencies, to provide access to quality education for children everywhere and youth and young adults everywhere. This special issue arrives at a moment of growing urgency. The number and intensity of conflicts remains high. I don't need to tell you all that. I'm sure you're very aware, but let me remind you of some of the statistics we're faced with. According to the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, PRIO, approximately 1.6 billion children live in a conflict-affected country, and ECW estimates that of the 258 million school-aged children affected by crises, 93 million are out of school entirely. Climate emergencies and food insecurity further disrupt education and add pressure on humanitarian and development actors to address gaps in data and evidence on issues that intersect with schooling. Researchers and scholars, in partnership with practitioners and policymakers, as I mentioned, have made significant progress. I want to underscore this note. There's been a lot of progress since the mid-90s when the movement for education, to support education in countries affected by crises and conflict, first took root among humanitarians. And this was when the field first began to coalesce. Yet this ecosystem remains fragmented and important questions persist, as you know, about the quality, equity, ethics, and usability of evidence. The authors in this issue examine these challenges and they suggest innovative frameworks for generating and safeguarding equitable and localized data and evidence in crisis and conflict-affected settings. I'm super excited to hear from all of the authors who happen to be present on the call today, in the webinar today. Each of them will speak briefly. Nate will tell us more about that, and I'm going to turn it back over to Nate now to explain to us the run of the show.
Thank you, Dana. Yes, even before we give the floor to our panelists, I need to say some very quick thank yous. Many thanks to the JEiE editorial board and to our editor-in-chief, Dr. Birdie, for your leadership and expertise in curating this issue. Thank you to our phenomenal staff, editorial assistants, Amina Rotari, Shelby Leach, and Josephine Aboué, and of course our managing editor, Samantha Colon. We're super grateful to this issue's sponsors, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, Hutter Foundation International, and New York University. Their support makes our commitment to producing and advancing rigorous, accessible evidence possible. JEiE is hosted by NYU and published by INEE, and so specific thanks, of course, go out to all the INEE members who make this possible, especially Sonia Anderson and Shreya Sherman. As Dana said, we are delighted to highlight 9 new articles today. So given this packed agenda, we've asked each panelist to deliver what we're calling a lightning presentation, a lightning talk about their article. The full text of each article is available from the INEE website starting today. So Sam will share in the chat the link to each article as I introduce each presenter. For our guests in the webinar, at any point during this session, you may pose questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you would like, please indicate who your question is for, or if it's for multiple panelists, and we'll try to answer as many of those questions as possible during our Q&A portion. But this is definitely just the start of the conversation. I encourage everyone attending who has a question to follow up with the authors. I know that they'd love to hear from you with your questions and about their article. Right. Finally, as a reminder to our panelists, to help keep us on time, we talked about We talked previously about how Josephine will timekeep for us and when to watch out for messages from Josephine. Great. So without any further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Silvia Diazgranados Ferráns, who will present the research article, What Works to Improve Social Emotional Skills in Conflict and Crisis Settings? Evidence from a Meta-Analysis of Education Interventions. Silvia is the Director of Education Research at the Airbel Impact Lab at International Rescue Committee. Silvia, go ahead if you'd like.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be part of this special issue. What we've done is really, uh, what to our knowledge is the first meta-analysis and cost-effectiveness analysis of education interventions that improve social emotional learning outcomes in conflict and crisis settings. As you all know, social emotional learning has become global education priority, especially that it has attracted a lot of interest as something to do for children in conflict and crisis settings. But despite growing investment, the evidence on whether education interventions improve social emotional learning outcomes has remained fragmented across different intervention types, different humanitarian contexts, and that has made it difficult for policymakers to really know what works to improve social emotional learning outcomes. So to address this gap, me and my co-authors, Bernard and Ignacio Lopez, have synthesized evidence from the 20 experimental and quasi-experimental studies that exist in the field. They have been conducted across 18 countries, covering school-age children affected by conflict and crisis. That we covered articles starting in the year 2000. Our objective was simple. We wanted to identify which education interventions improve social emotional learning, how large those impacts are, and what we know about their cost effectiveness. If you go to the next slide, please. So what did we find? Importantly, we find that education interventions in conflict and crisis settings do improve children's social emotional learning. We found an average effect of 0.10 standard deviations, and this is a significant effect and based on the 20 rigorous studies. Interestingly, many of those studies themselves had null impacts, but the meta-analysis allows us to have more power and aggregate the effect. And so we know that education can positively affect social emotional learning outcomes. We also found at the same time that the effects that are observed in conflict and crisis settings, despite the promise and despite the need, they are smaller than those that are typically observed in stable high-income settings, where meta-analysis in these types of settings have reported effects ranging from 0.11 to 0.20 standard deviations, so significantly higher. We also found, when we looked at the different types of interventions, we found first that mental health and psychosocial support programs showed the largest estimated effects, but there's significant variation among the types of interventions. Also, there's some that, while they have the largest, some are null, some are have positive effects. By contrast, academic interventions that integrate social emotional learning practices, such as social emotional learning activities or positive school climate approaches, show more consistent positive evidence. We also found emerging evidence about comprehensive social emotional learning curricula and peace education interventions. The evidence remains more limited. Overall, the findings suggest that education interventions can improve social emotional learning, but impacts vary considerably across different intervention types of context. If you go to the next slide. We also, in addition to this, we also looked at cost effectiveness. So not only if the interventions are impactful, but also what is their cost and what is their value for money. And we found, interestingly, that there's a lot less evidence on cost effectiveness. Very few studies actually report comparable cost effectiveness estimates, and this makes it difficult to determine which approaches provide the greatest value for money. We found that, especially compared to literacy and numeracy interventions, the cost of programs that are trying to improve social emotional learning is significantly higher. And also, as of now, many are currently not cost effective. Okay. Um, we we our interpretation is not that social emotional learning education interventions are not cost effective, but that and that we shouldn't invest in them, but that social emotional interventions in conflict and crisis settings have not yet undergone the same types of optimization, simplification, and scaling processes that have been used in many of the foundational learning interventions that exist in conflict and crisis settings. So a challenge and the next frontier for research and for implementers in these settings is to really improve these interventions of social emotional learning, but design them in a way that are more scalable, sustainable, and cost effective. We know they're impactful, but we need to really try to find ways to optimize them so they're more effective, cost effective for millions of children in conflict and crisis settings. I'm very excited about this and for the opportunity to share the work, and I'm hoping that you take a look at the link and the publication in the Journal of Education Emergencies. Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you, Silvia. Great. Next, Alana Heyer and Dr. Shun Bunmi Adebayo will present their research article, Perceptions of School and Community Safety and Links to Education Outcomes in Contexts of Forced Displacement, Evidence and Mitigation Strategies from Project 21 Countries in the Central Sahel. Alana is a higher education officer at UNHCR, and Seun is a pedagogy and digital inclusion lead at UNHCR. Alana and Seun, please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Nathan, and a big thank you to the INEE team for the opportunity to present today. As you said, my name is Alana, and I work in the education unit of the UN Refugee Agency. Very pleased to present today. So our research leveraged data from Project 21, which is a community-based monitoring system that covers Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Chad, Mali, and Niger. We sought to explore perceptions of school and community safety and association with education outcomes. So for context, in this data set, the only education indicator is regular school attendance. There is an ample evidence base on school-related violence and its impact on child well-being and education outcomes, of course, but our research addresses several evidence gaps. Firstly, no international surveys that we reviewed include modules to identify forced displacement status. Also, very few studies have attempted to understand the prevalence and perceptions of school-related violence and its impact on education outcomes in forced displacement context. And then finally, the limited literature that does exist on school-based violence among forcibly displaced persons does not address the often more significant association between community-based violence and education outcomes. What makes Project 21 data very unique is that it includes detailed disaggregation on forced displacement status of surveyed households. And this data set is actually available for anyone to explore and use as a licensed resource in the UNHCR microdata library, which is the main source of forced displacement microdata. It hosts a wealth of data from UNHCR and our partner organizations, and so that is available to look at, and I will be putting the links in the chat, but very happy to pass it over to Sean to talk about the findings. Thanks.
Thanks, Alana, and hello, everyone. Next slide, please. So I'm going to walk us through the methodology and the key findings from our research. As mentioned by my colleague, we used Project 21 data from 2020 to 2023, and from these, we generated descriptive statistics around logistics regression analysis to test the relationship between safety perceptions and school participation, and conducted bivariant geospatial analysis to compare perceived school safety against actual armed conflicts incidents on the ground. We complemented this quantitative work with semi-structured interviews with senior staff at international organizations coordinating and implementing education and protection responses in the region, giving us both the numbers and on-the-ground context behind them. Now the key findings. First, we found a significant positive relationship between school participation and perceptions of both school and community safety. When caregivers feel schools and communities are safe, children are more likely to attend school regularly. But notably, that protective effect of feeling safe was smaller for forcibly displaced children than for host community children. In other words, Even when displaced families perceive their school as safe, that perception translates into less of an attendance boost, suggesting displacement itself introduces additional barriers that safety alone doesn't resolve. Second, there is a widespread perception that schools and communities are simply not safe. 41% of households told us they see schools as unsafe, and 33% feel the same about their communities. Third, and this is important for how we think about programming. The reasons behind this insecurity are not about violence happening inside the classroom like bullying. Instead, households pointed to a lack of safe infrastructure, the presence of hostile or unidentified armed actors, and direct attacks or threats against the school or community itself. So, what does this mean for mitigation? Effective responses can't just be about the school climate or peer relationships. They require sustained preparedness and emergency planning, systemic integration of protection principles, and psychosocial support into education programming, adaptive delivery models like locating learning spaces closer to communities, proximity-based infrastructure, and deep ongoing community engagement. Together, these findings tells us that safety in the Central Sahel is a systems level issue, not a school level one. And our mitigation strategies need to reflect that. Thank you, and we encourage everyone to read more in our article.
Thank you so much, Alana and Sean. Next, Farman Khan will present the research article, Can EdTech Improve Accelerated Emergency Education Programs? Empirical Evidence from Pakistan After COVID-19. Farman is a program director at Save the Children. Over to you, Farman.
Thank you. Thank you, Nathan, for the opportunity to present this important work which we did during the COVID pandemic. So the background is that when the pandemic hit the country, so there was a challenge as we mentioned in the research that in Pakistan more than 55 percent girls are already out of schools and they are not going to schools. So when the pandemic hit, there was a challenge that how we can keep continue the learning of the children, and especially where Save the Children was working on the accelerated learning program, which was for the out of school girls, where we enrolled the girls of age to 11 to 14 to complete their primary and middle level education. But with this pandemic, there was no opportunities that they can continue because the even the system was not available, but connecting them with the internet and those facilities was also a challenging job. So we at the Save the Children, we started in the initial phase like the remote learning facilities and the WhatsApp, but that was not the sustainable because the internet issues were, you can say, in the rural area is the big issue where you can connect the teachers and the students and they can continue learning. So for this, we piloted the learning tea application, which was two-phase, like it was for the student and for the teachers also. And the good feature of this application was the teachers and the students can use it offline also. Once they upload and download all the material, they can use those in their free time and without any access to the internet. So the study snapshot, what we have shown we are here, the total girls we piloted in this studies was age 11 to 12, 483 girls, and there was 50 accelerated learning centers. The 25 was the control who was using the learning tree application, and the 25 was those who are not using the application. And we use this application with these or within these accelerated learning center for the 4 months. So from the start of the baseline to the end line. And the main basic domain tested was the literacy, numeracy, socio-emotional learning, and executive functioning. So this was the main domain which we tested with the HALDO tools. It was a longitudinal quasi experiment evaluation comparing all these learning gains and with and without application with the HALDO tool, which is molded with multivariate regression and those things. So next slide, please. If we see the results, the result was, although the time was bliss, it was the pilot. The initiative was very new to the country education systems and to the children, and the many challenges for access to the mobile by these girl students, because there was some conservative families, or you can say the rural issue with those girls, that the girls cannot access the mobile phone. So, but the result what we have again in these 4 months were very, you can say, positive, that how EdTech can continue the learning of children. So the overall learning and development gains were multiplied by twice, like it was double by the initial 15 plus 0.1% points aggregate. And the literacy was 5 times more than the basic, with 27.6 points. And the same is the numeracy, which was the 4 times with 21.2 points gain. And executive functionings, which was almost more than the double, which was plus 19 points, and the socio-emotional learning, which was very, because the children were facing the socio-emotional learning issues during the COVID, and it was the first time this type of emergency, although Pakistan is more prone to the emergency, but the kind of and the nature of emergency was totally different, because in those emergency, even it is floods, earthquake, or something else, the children can move, they can mingle, they can face to face with the children. But this was because the 100% schools, even the public and private, was closed. So this was a unique type of nature of emergency for the country, with the weak education system, weak infrastructure, and not, you can say, was the properly adoptable things with this emergency. So
Hi, Farman. Thank you for Josephine here. It's the end of the allotted
yeah,
time.
so that's
we
my
need to move
last point. My
forward.
last okay. So if we see the result, that well-designed mobile edtech paired with the in-person accelerated learning and human support can help close the education gaps for the girls in emergency. Even the SCL improved, and novel result of application limited face-to-face interaction. Thank you.
Thank you, Farman, and thanks for your cooperation with that tight timeline. Great. Next, we will hear from Marian Imboden about the research article Hypergovernance and Multi-Layered Data Accountability in Haiti, Implications for Leadership of NGO Schools. Marian is a doctoral candidate in international education policy at the University of Freiburg. Marian, please go ahead.
Yes, hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the kind introduction. I am very happy to be here today and to have the opportunity to share insights from our article with the title Hypergovernance and Multi-Layered Data Accountability in Haiti, Implications for Leadership of NGO Schools. So our study asks one central question: how do school leaders in NGO schools in Haiti interface with the collection, analysis, and uptake of education data and evidence? To explore this question, we conducted an exploratory qualitative case study of one Haitian NGO. We used semi-structured interviews with school leaders and NGO staff, complemented by observations and document review, to understand how data practices unfold in everyday school life. Our analysis is guided by the concept of hypergovernance, which captures the overlapping governance and accountability system that shape education in Haiti. And we also draw on the concepts of legibility and legitimacy to examine how schools become visible and credible through data within these multiple accountability frameworks. Together, these concepts helped us to understand not only how data are collected and reported, but also how school leaders navigate competing expectations about what data matter, whom data serve, and how evidence is used. Could you please move to the next slide? Thank you. So our findings show that school leaders collect data from multiple donors, as well as for the NGO and the government, each with different reporting requirements, leaving little opportunity to use data for school improvement. We found that school leaders act as data intermediaries as they translate local realities into reports for external actors, but they have little influence over what data are collected or how they are used. As a result, external priorities often fail to reflect the local needs. For example, directors described a strong stigma around mental health, making psychosocial support difficult to implement and monitor, despite it being a key external priority. Based on these findings, we recommend involving school directors in setting school-level goals and decisions so that the priorities are more realistic and context-sensitive. And we also recommend harmonizing reporting systems across donors, NGOs, and government actors to reduce duplication and make data more useful for school improvement. And ultimately, we believe that strengthening the role of school leaders and creating a more coherent data ecosystem would allow data to support not only accountability, but also better decision-making and school improvement. Yes, I'm very excited to be part of this discussion and this new issue, and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marian. Just to echo that, the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen is open at any time as you're hearing things you'd like to get more into. In the question and answer period, please put your questions there. Thank you again, Marian. I would like to now introduce Dr. Celia Reddick, who will present the research article, How Decisions Are Made, Organizational Isomorphism and a Focus on English in Refugee Education. Celia is an assistant professor of education and international development at Florida State University. Go ahead, Celia.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And yeah, the title is a bit of a mouthful. So this paper is part of a larger comparative case study examining issues of language in refugee education. For this project, I conducted interviews with refugee children and parents living in Kampala, Uganda, as well as with their teachers, and then with program leaders and policymakers who are actually designing and leading refugee education efforts in Uganda. And this is the focus of this particular paper and presentation. This paper focuses on these conversations and addresses the question, how do government officials, NGO policymakers, and program leaders, those who create and enact education policies for refugees, how do they make decisions about language in refugee education? To answer this question, I conducted 34 in-depth interviews across 18 different organizations and observations as well with decision makers in Uganda. As many of you on the call know, Uganda hosts the largest population of refugees in Africa and the third largest in the world. And it's known for its sort of progressive approach to refugee education in that refugees are permitted to attend school alongside national Ugandan students, making issues of language urgently relevant in these classrooms. My work is informed by research about the many ways that unfamiliar languages of school can limit academic performance, thriving, and inclusion for young people and for refugees. As I conducted the analysis, I began to realize that there were these processes of isomorphism at play. And isomorphism is just a clunky word for for a concept that comes out of neo-institutional theory and highlights the ways that organizations in the same field become more and more like each other, even as they're striving to differentiate themselves. So through analysis of the interviews and observations, I find, first of all, that EIE, Education in Emergencies, is an institutionally defined field that makes it very susceptible to this isomorphism. Groups of organizations and government officials engaged in this work meet frequently through working groups and other formal structures in Uganda, or at least this was the case before the kind of pullback of aid. Within this very formal structure, there's frequent interaction, and there's also huge amounts of uncertainty about the work and how to achieve it. So there are fluxes in refugee populations, shifting financial realities, and an emerging research base about refugee education, but a lack of clarity about what works, so to speak. This is also a mission-driven group of organizations, which is one of the aspects of isomorphism or the aspects of a field that can really drive isomorphism, that there's this sort of idea of being committed to a certain mission. And in the end, this results in a lot of similarity between organizations. So I found that because Education in Emergencies faced these pressures toward isomorphism, there was a real sort of sameness in what evolved in language programming. The decision makers I interviewed expressed a desire to embrace refugees' multilingualism at school and in educational programming, and to take on really innovative projects. But because of these various pressures, they inevitably ended up defaulting to English language programming instead, even when in the same breath, decision makers were sort of regretting the need to do that. There was one exception to this rule, and I won't go into huge amounts of detail about this, but I will see that this participant, Naomi, who led a different kind of initiative, taught me a few things that I think can be informative. I think it's important to be cautious about existing structures like working groups and shared national plans, which is the case in Uganda. These can be very helpful and they can support efficiency in the refugee response, but they can also get in the way of innovation. At the moment, of course, we know that these structures are under extreme strain, with the hope that one day they can be reformed and they won't be under such a strain. As this takes place, and if this takes place, building in cycles of data sharing, reflection, and course correction, building that into working group meetings and other collaborative structures can be really valuable to buttressing against this experience of isomorphism and just defaulting to what may seem more attainable. And then finally, it's vital to address challenges of training and expertise. I found that very few of the professionals I worked with had the expertise to make decisions about language and refugee education confidently, and they themselves said that. But that locally led rapid assessments can really provide valuable insights to fill in some of those gaps for professionals who are feeling that they have to make decisions in the dark. And this can then provide data for decision making, especially as global funding cuts exert extreme pressure toward conformity. Thanks so much.
Thank
And
you,
I'm really
Celia.
thinking we never moved the slide forward. Sorry, I should have asked for that.
I believe we may be able to share a copy of the slide deck. This presentation will be uploaded to INEE's YouTube page, and I think that we can create a page on the site with the link to the slides and the YouTube recording. Great. Yeah, thank you again, Celia. I would like to now introduce Dr. Ali Krupar, who will present the field note, Exploring how EIEPC data and evidence support teaching and learning in practice, implementing the holistic assessment for learning in Syria. Ali is a lead advisor in research for evidence and learning at Save the Children, US. Go ahead, Ali.
Thank you, Nathan, and thanks to the JEiE editorial board for organizing this panel and publication. So I am presenting on behalf of my co-authors, Wafa Alamera, Bem Tivka, Khaled Al-Yusuf and Abir Al-Atari. So as a field note, we're highlighting a practice we tested to better understand formative assessment in education in emergencies and protracted crises. When education is disruptive, summative assessments often don't happen. Teachers aren't always sure of their students' skills, needs, and challenges due to unreliable enrollments, children's varied educational disruptions, and experiences during crises. So how do teachers know when children are learning? So formative assessments are used globally to help teachers stay responsive to their learners' needs, and we explored how we can use structured formative assessments in crisis. So HAL is the Holistic Assessment for Learning. It's a formative assessment for children in grades 2 and 3, measures literacy, numeracy, social and emotional learning all together. HAL was designed in 2018 and piloted in 2019 with over 1,400 children in Syria. In 2023, Save the Children and Arfada for Development rolled out HAL across non-formal and formal education in Northwest and Northeast Syria, which is the basis of this field note. So the rollout had 3 phases. First, we piloted the tool in non-formal education. We trained enumerators, and they assessed 604 children in grades 2 and 3 across 61 schools in 5 governorates. Then we tested the usability. So 20 teachers from 6 partner organizations took a 3-day training in Arabic. They tried the paper version of HAL with their own students, and their feedback really helped us shape and revise items, procedures, and guidance. Then we scaled up. So we trained 789 teachers in non-formal and formal settings, and backed that up with 50 field visits and 50 phone interviews to find out how using the tool went. Next slide, please. So what did we learn? First, teachers used the data. They used HAL results to identify learning levels, to differentiate instruction, and to plan lessons. HAL, as an administration guide, actually includes some lesson suggestions, but they were also using their own curriculum. Many NFE teachers had never used a structured formative assessment before, so this was something that they found and told us built their confidence in using data in their classroom. And then teacher learning circles kept the momentum going. So teachers in each school already had teacher learning circles where they met, and when they were using HAL, they discussed HAL and supported each other in using formative assessments and results in the classroom. So the adaptation, though, and secondly, is very important. This is a finding from the original development of HAL. It's true of almost any learning assessment that we've ever done, but was really reiterated during the expansion of the tool. So HAL was aligned first with the local NFE curricula. It can be used on tablets, but often with teachers, tablets aren't appropriate. So the paper versions worked and were tested. And then with teachers shortening the tool in that second stage, that helped reduce fatigue. They also flagged that literacy items were often too easy later in the school year. And so that's for future development and thinking about how we can expand the formative assessment to sort of cover that full age grade level. But we have to be realistic. In crises, real barriers got in the way. So there were approvals, rough roads, and insecurity that limited access to some schools. Some teachers prompted students during tasks, which is very difficult to avoid for teachers who want to teach children. So they were trying to help, but it did, from a research perspective, bias results of the formative data. As a formative tool, though, it's not necessarily a problem for teachers to be supporting children to answer the questions correctly because they're helping the children learn during the assessment. The other big issue, and this relates to the data ecosystem, is that HAL data remains siloed from national education systems, so it limits the systemic impact. So that brings me to the biggest takeaway. Formative assessments can anchor education in emergencies data ecosystems, but only when the tool fits in the context. Teachers have training and peer support, and linking classroom data to bigger systems is systematically built. That didn't happen in this case, and also can't happen without dedicated buy-in and capacity with government representatives. So we also need clear data flows, roles, and purposes, so that data keeps serving teaching and learning inside the classroom instead of becoming extractive. So thank you all, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ali. I'd like to now introduce Gray Reinhardt, who will present the field note, Confronting Research Neocolonialism, Reflections on a Quantitative Study Co-Design in Myanmar. Gray is an education specialist and independent researcher. And go ahead, Gray.
Much, Nathan. Let me start with a child. In Myanmar's monastic schools, many children board as novice monks or nuns. Now, on a generic survey, they would probably only tick a box marked boarder. But many of these children board not for religious education. Monastic schools in Myanmar are secular, but rather because a monastery is protection. It's protection from conflict, from forced recruitment into armed groups, and from instability at home. Now, a generic category doesn't just miss detail, it measures the wrong construct. That, in one example, is why our field note argues that localizing global instruments gets methodology backwards. This field note is co-authored with my colleagues Myat Bandar Ong, Nobwe Pa, Mei Yi Mint, and Solemu. And I'd like to name attention up front. I am the co-author originally from the Global North, presenting a paper about confronting research neocolonialism. That is, situations where Global North actors design and control research, while Global South partners play subordinate or instrumental roles. It is important to note that we write about research neocolonialism in terms of institutional affiliation. And institutionally, I consider myself Global South. Having said that, my co-author's knowledge is really the substance of what follows. Now, briefly, the context. Eric's Pathways for Learning study runs in 4 countries. Ours is Myanmar. And since the 2021 military coup here, Myanmar is best understood not as a coherent nation state, but as a space of multiple sovereignties. So evidence cannot default to a central ministry as its audience. Our study works through partners with local legitimacy. PPWT, Phuput Thi in monastic education, and the KECD, the Karen Education and Culture Department in Kothule. With colleagues at the IRC and at UCL, as a part of ERIC, we co-designed background questionnaires for students, teachers, and principals across 4 phases: grounding, building, testing, and refining. And we piloted it in relevant local languages with both psychometric checks and qualitative piloting. On to the next slide, please. So 3 principles emerged from that work. First, redistributing epistemic authority. Southern knowledge as the architecture of valid measurement, not as contextual color to be added at the end. The border example from before is one case. Teacher remuneration is another. In Karen schools, teaching is an act of service, which is rooted in community identity, and the question wording needed to honor that. Second, contextual and cultural humility, treating external instruments and the knowledge within as provisional rather than authoritative. Items that look technically sound can carry political weight. In Myanmar, words like peace and unity have long histories of co-optation by military and state actors. You cannot simply drop them into a civic attitude scale and expect valid answers. Third and final is interdependent expertise. Northern colleagues brought psychometric structure. Southern colleagues knew what could safely be asked, how to frame armed conflict, so principals could actually answer. Technical expertise was indeed important, and it provided essential structure, but it was also partial. Relational expertise made the technical expertise function at all. We also fell short in our endeavors in some ways, and the field note says so. Timelines were compressed, which limited the depth of our reflection while creating instruments. Learning about survey design happened more incidentally through doing rather than through intentional capacity building. So our recommendation is that capacity building should carry weight comparable to evidence generation itself. Otherwise, Southern teams may contribute intellectual labor without investments in their long-term research sovereignty. Now, our reflections come from Myanmar, but we feel that they may speak to North-South partnerships across our field. And in closing, we conclude that co-design is not a formula. Rather, it is relational and ethical work. Thank you very much. I look forward to engaging with those of you in the audience that have questions and answers. Over to you, Nathan.
Thanks, Gray. I'd like to now introduce Janice DeSouza and Dr. Jeremy Bryan Coates, who will present their field note, Data Stewardship and Trauma-Informed Care in Online Professional Development for Afghan Adult Learners, Lessons from Practice. Janice is an evaluation and research lead at the Institute for International Education, and Jeremy is the Director of International Programs and Partnerships at the Daria Moore School of Business, University of South Carolina. Janice and Jeremy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Nathan. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So the study we're going to, or the field note that we're going to discuss today is kind of based on a long time collaboration between Janice and me, where I served oftentimes as the program director implementing new programs while she was the evaluation lead on all these programs. And when we received this grant to implement this online professional development program for Afghan adult learners, especially women, Janice came up with the idea because of her public health background, and why don't we take a public health approach to this? As all of us know, for a little bit of context, of course, once the Taliban returned to power in 2021, this limited opportunities for Afghans to receive ongoing online or ongoing professional development from outside, and as this especially impacted women who were barred from education opportunities and from the workforce as well. And so Janice's idea was, well, why don't we, take this approach where we're basically not trying to re-traumatize our participants in the program. And we were able to do so with over 400 learners who enrolled in this professional development program, and 60 to 70% identified as women. Now, this trauma-informed principles, which of course are, looking at safety, data minimization, participant agency, harm reduction, all practices that go hand in hand with data stewardship. And that was really at the front end of all of our activity, was thinking about how we could, ethically protect that data throughout the process. So, we came up with some different activities as part of the program. Of course, protecting users' identities. We were doing an online program where participants were engaging with one another and with facilitators, course facilitators, so giving them full license over their own kind of data and information and how they identified themselves throughout. Of course, supporting secure data handling. The only individuals who had access to the names, email address, and everything for these participants was us. It was not given even to the program funder, because we were that serious about not allowing their information to be leaked. We didn't know what kind of harm could come to them if we were, allowing some of the women to be known as they were participating in this learning opportunity. Of course, we kept our communication encrypted as part of this program via WhatsApp, and we also gave lots of guidance to our learners on how to protect their identities by clearing browser information and how they could protect their information, especially if they're on shared devices. For example, if they were, sharing device with other people in their home who may not want them to be learning, especially as women. Also making sure that they giving them consent and anonymity and monitoring and evaluation activities. And then, of course, being very, as I've mentioned already, aware of the context throughout the design with low bandwidth, and how individuals can connect to their learning or the online courses in that way. And of course, working with our online vendor who provided these courses and helping them understand the data protection practices and the intersection of that with the trauma-informed approach of the program. So I'll move it over to Janice, who will discuss a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. And maybe we could advance the slide. So looking back, 4 lessons really stood out to us, and you'll see that the first was protecting learners. Had to come before collecting data. I'm an evaluator, and in evaluation, we're often trained to ask, what data do we need? And evaluators can be very generous. We'll say, oh, we want all of it. Give us all of it. But in this context, the better question really was, what data can we safely avoid collecting? And this shifted a lot of our decisions from minimizing personally identifying information to making monitoring voluntary to really thinking about who actually needed access to this participant data, even the funder. So we realized that every piece of information we collected, carried some level of risk, and that's what we weighed. The second was that privacy really required some trade-offs. So by limiting data collection and protecting anonymity, we also reduced our ability to track learners over time. So we couldn't really measure long-term outcomes or sometimes even help participants build professional networks in that way. And those are genuine losses. But in this setting, protecting participants had to take priority. And you'll see in the field note that this didn't mean sacrificing rigor. It just meant being much more intentional about what we measured and why we measured it.
Hi, Janice. Thank you for Josephine here. That's the end of the allotted time. So we will need to move forward to the next presenter. Thank you so much. You may share more in the webinar chat. Thank you again.
Okay.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you, Jeremy. Sorry for the cutoff. Yes, please continue to share in the chat about your piece, and everyone should follow the links that Sam is putting in the chat for finding these articles online. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Friedrich Affolter, who will present the field note, The Multifaceted Responsibilities of Education Clusters, Successes, and Struggles. Friedrich held roles as Chief of Education, Program Manager, and Global Education Cluster Lead, and recently retired from UNICEF. So go ahead, Friedrich.
Thank you, Nathan. And I would also like to acknowledge my co-author, Michelle Brown from Save the Children International, which helped to produce this paper. And thanking JEiE to put the topic of coordination on the map. We do a lot of research, we talk a lot about programming, but the aspect of coordination is very often not visible, but it is an important piece of EAE programming. This field note documents practice-based insights from coordination efforts which function in 24 crisis contexts around the world. So in that sense, it's not just a field note, it is a fields note. Many fields are being looked at as we prepared this document. The note helps the AE community to understand how coordination actually works in crisis settings and why it sometimes does not work. It identifies strengths and limitations of the education cluster approach. It translates operational experience into shared learning, and it supports stronger future responses. This is very relevant because with the humanitarian funding freeze and the humanitarian reset discussions, a lot is being scrutinized, and also the role of cluster coordination. Next slide, please. The paper very briefly introduced why the cluster system was established. It came out of the Darfur crisis, where there was a lot of duplication, lack of coordination, and basically a bad response which led to ineffectiveness and inefficiencies. It is anchored in the IASC 6+1 core functions and the humanitarian project cycles. And the paper then tries to basically look at 4 aspects of cluster performance. Is the cluster really an inclusive response system? Does it coordinate planning and operationalization? How does it manage knowledge and generates evidence? And how is the education cluster in particular doing in resource mobilization? And to summarize, we can say that in terms of successes, first of all, the cluster works with more than 1,000 organizations across 24 contexts. That was the statistics of 24. the majority of them local organizations. And it has succeeded to coordinate responses in socio-culturally diverse and politically very sensitive crisis settings. It has built a very large, diverse and civil society membership base, and it has a strong capacity for evidence generation, knowledge production, advocacy, and capacity building. But it also has encountered several limitations, and the paper tries to critically reflect about them. The biggest challenge is that educators in emergency contexts have difficulties countering donor tendencies to deprioritize education in favor of immediately life-saving sectors like WASH, health, and nutrition. And when individual organizations are already struggling, then the coordination networks are struggling as well. The funding constraints are also hindering a more decentralized and localized education cluster coordination. We are very, very strong, we are being told, in generating access, but we cannot really monitor the quality of learning because of short time windows. And we are being criticized for not being sufficiently present and sometimes over-bureaucratic on the ground. Conclusion, crisis-affected populations demand education for their children, and they say aid without education is not dignified. That is a very important argument, which continues need to be made. Education coordination should therefore remain a central determinant of effective education responses, and we face an uphill battle as long as systemic funding and governance shortcomings sideline children's long-term developmental needs. Thank you very much, JEiE, for putting the topic of education and coordination on the map, and I hope in the future there will be not just field notes, but even research papers on the subject. Over.
Thank you, Friedrich. Next slide, please. I have the task and the privilege of facilitating a very brief question and answer period in just a moment, but I also wanted to acknowledge that there are several other pieces in the special issue that debuted today that you may find if you read the issue. A fantastic commentary article by Francine Menashe and several very good, insightful book reviews. So again, please check out the entire issue. That's just a bit of extra content you'll find in the issue. Next slide, I suppose. Okay, so we've gotten a couple of questions in the Zoom chat, and I'm already seeing folks exchanging emails and planning to do follow-ups, which is excellent. Very excited to see that. So please continue that coordination. Many of our authors have provided a contact email address with their article in the new JEiE issue in the back of the issue in a contributors section. So if you'd like to follow up with someone, either find their contact information there, or you can reach out to the journal editorial office at journal@inee.org, and we'll facilitate a connection with the author you're hoping to contact. Like Sam said, please use the Q&A feature to pose some questions. We'll take probably just 5 minutes or take 1 or 2 questions. I'm really sorry that we can't get to more. And also, panelists, feel free to ask questions of each other. So just because I see it in the Q&A function, question for Friedrich. While local organizations make up more than half of members in the cluster system, is there any analysis of how empowered local organizations are to receive funds, lead in partnership or consortia, or make decisions within the sector? Something about local leadership.
There's research about how local organizations view themselves in the context of international organizations and the role they would like to play. There is a complaint and a criticism that local NGOs are being neglected in funding, but it is not just a neglect, it is also very often there are donor demands which local organizations cannot meet. It is a very big topic which cannot be quickly discussed, but the question is right on. Not only local organizations, even in local organizations, we also should look at local women's voices, because local organizations are often disregarded, but within local organizations also the voice of local women is very often not coming out. Over.
Thank you, Friedrich. I just wonder if any of the other panelists might want to join in on an answer about working effectively with local partners or finding the local partners that are the best place to work with. Go ahead,
Maybe I'll
Silvia.
jump in. Yeah, maybe I'll jump in. I think in the meta-analysis, one of the things that we, as you saw, we found is that while programs are impactful, they are not as impactful as they are in other settings, okay? And I think one of the hypotheses that we have, and it's to connect to what you're saying, is that some of these programs have been imported without appropriate localization. And so some of these programs, some of the education interventions have not been, they're not showing very good evidence of alignment with the local priorities and the local values. And so it is, in the meta-analysis, there's a call for really localization and partnering with local, or not partnering, but basically doing the work in ways that are aligned with local partners and local stakeholders, such that the education interventions are more impactful, implemented with better uptake, and in ways that are aligned with the local realities and the cultures. Okay, so yeah, connecting to that issue of local partnerships.
Thank you, Silvia. Any of our panelists also feel free to jump in. Any questions for each other? Go ahead, Gray. I see your hand.
Hey, thanks, Nathan. I see that a colleague on the chat has a question for me, but they put it in the chat. Do you mind if I answer it in the plenary?
Yeah, go ahead. Sure, absolutely.
So colleague Emil Giavram writes, what methodologies or processes have we found to be the most impactful in order to enable co-design? And I just will maybe speak to processes and kind of more informal processes. So at ERIC, we've been very fortunate to have principal investigators and colleagues from global North institutions who have been very generous with their time. So much of our work in designing the whole quantitative wave was done remotely. And so we have had colleagues from global North partner institutions who were very, very generous with their time. We recognized that we did have deadlines that we needed to meet, but everyone was able to, give a very full commitment. And everyone was also very much open for listening and learning from those of us working within the education systems themselves, which we sought to research. And that kind of goes to the three of the principles that I mentioned, the principle of contextual and cultural humility. So we're very fortunate to have really good PIs and colleagues that allowed back and forth and lots of iteration. And ultimately, the organizations working in those education systems were the ones that were more or less given final cut or had final approval of all of the items that went into our quant surveys. But there was still, there's still a tension between wanting to have comparability between the 4 country contexts that are part of the pathways for learning, and then also wanting to ensure as much country level relevance as possible. Naming this and addressing this or recognizing this from the onset was very helpful, so that everyone everyone who is contributing to the creation of these tools would be on the same page. So these are kind of like informal processes. There's no like one recipe or kind of linear trajectory, but it's about having, I guess, kind of the right mindsets and values in the room. Thanks.
Great. Yeah. Ali, were you hoping to jump in on this point?
No, I just saw another question in the chat, so we can continue that conversation.
If you feel like you can give an answer in about a minute, do you wanna take that one on, or should we take that offline?
It's a really good question. I don't know if I could do it in a minute, but I would say that the formative assessment data needs to stay in the classroom first, and then we can talk about getting it into the system, since the whole purpose of it is to inform classroom practices. But yeah, in terms of connecting it with impact data, I think that is something to have further conversations on. Thank you.
Silvia, you're mentioned in this question.
Yeah, I'll say that. I mean, let me just say that the meta-analysis that we did, this is the one on social emotional learning. There's another one that is coming on, on IGES, on a different issue on foundational learning, literacy and numeracy outcomes. But as part of the work, the ERIC project extracted, identify all of the rigorous experimental and quasi-experimental studies conducted in conflict and crisis settings. So we have two pieces out, but we have a lot of additional information, for example, looking at the impact of education interventions on mental health outcomes, okay, for children. But we also have them on the, we just haven't, we just don't have the pieces out yet. But we also have, for example, on teacher outcomes. And so, but there's not a lot of information on teacher outcomes. And so to do a meta-analysis on how, for example, education interventions are changing classroom practices, for example, right? We have identified some of those studies, and so you would really need to extract sample sizes, have a comparison group, you need to have effect sizes, you need to have a bunch of standard errors, a bunch of things to do this type of meta-analysis, and we have actually already identified all of the studies from 2020 up until now that do that, but there's not enough. There's not actually a lot for us to at this point do a meta-analysis. One of the things is that not a lot of there's not a lot of data on the impacts on teacher outcomes. Just a few of those studies that are experimental, quasi-experimental will extract that, will provide that type of data. And so that's definitely a gap in the field. We have, and by the way, the full data set with all the impacts and for each study, that will become eventually a public good of the ERIC project. So will be, so people will know that so far there's 6 studies documenting impact on teacher outcomes. Maybe not enough for a meta-analysis, but in the future we could continue doing that. But so impact, effect sizes, standard errors, sample sizes, things like that on teacher outcomes, like classroom observations, for example. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Silvia. This is just a sample, just a taste of the ideas and the debates that the issue is meant to spark. So I'm glad to see that happening in brief, really, here. So to bring us home, I just want to throw it over to Dana for some comments to bring everything together and blend. Thanks, Dana.
Thank you so much, Nate, and thank you, everyone. This has been so terrific. I'm so excited about all of these papers. I'm so excited to see the publication and all of our hard work over these many months come together. Let me just take a couple minutes to highlight a few key takeaways that I heard from the presentations, and these should go back. It should encourage all of you to go back and read the full articles, not only of these pieces, but of all of the ones that are in this terrific special issue. So as I said, I'm just going to take a couple of points, a few points, because we don't have a lot of time left. But what stands out, a few points that stand out to me from these terrific lightning talks you've just heard are the following. First, that when we think about understanding social emotional learning and the impact, there has been a lot of investment in social emotional learning around the world and concern about the effects. But Silvia is now showing us that indeed there are some very positive effects that range in different types of social and emotional learning outcomes. And that when we have, as we continue to develop this field in this important area, we hope to see ways forward that will be more cost effective and actually easier to target. So I think that's a really important point from Silvia's piece. A second point that I want to bring out is from the 21 project across multiple countries from UNHCR, Alana and Sean presented today. I just want to underscore how important it is that all these years we've been talking about schools as safe spaces, but in fact, according to these data, 41% of these communities, members of these communities, think schools and the surrounding areas are not safe. That is critically important for the way we think about restructuring practitioner work to improve safety in these areas. And I think it's because thinking of schools as safe is such a critical element of education emergencies. It's really important to pay attention to these data and work on strengthening that environment for the kids who need it. The last point I want to make is about Celia's work. Actually, I have two quick additional points. Celia's work on isomorphism in the field. I think this is also really important when we think about how education and emergencies data and evidence is structured, and we think about the way the institutions, we're proud of the fact that we work as researchers, practitioners, policymakers, funders, people in the field work collectively often to tackle problems from different angles, from the angles of our strengths. And yet that working together also has consequences. Institutions shape the field and sometimes constrain options. So I love that Cecilia has presented ways to critique those possible constraints, and just also drawn attention to the fact that those constraints exist. Let me finally note that the idea from one of the field notes that are in this publication, from Afghanistan, points out the importance of considering participants' safety, research participants' safety as a core piece of research design. Many researchers think about this already because of requirements from institutional review boards at institutions in the US, for example, and I know in many other countries, but prioritizing that safety in a new way and thinking about it differently, I think is what the field note highlights, and I think critically important, not just in Afghanistan, but elsewhere. So with that, I'm really excited. As I said, I'm thrilled to have this publication come to fruition. And the last point I want to make before I turn it back over to Nate is we could not have done this without the funders that Nate mentioned, but without Nate himself. He thanked everybody else, but I want to make a specific special thanks. I want to say a specific special thanks to Nate for carrying this project through, and thanks to Sam and our whole team at JEiE. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day, evening, afternoon, wherever you are. Over to you, Nate.
Yep, thank you, Dana. Very privileged to be part of the team. Thanks again. Visit the JEiE page on the INEE website to read the special issue and all of our past issues, which we are very proud to always offer for free as a global public good, free of charge, that diamond open access model that Dana mentioned at the top of the program. Please continue the conversation. If you would like us to facilitate connection with any of the authors you heard from today, please just message us at journal@inee.org. Follow us on X and Blue Sky. Our handle is @journaloneIE. As I mentioned, a recording of this webinar will be available on the INEE site in the coming days. And finally, thank you again to the presenters, and congratulations on getting your work out to our field. Congratulations. Thanks everyone for attending this webinar event, and have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.
Thank you.